Good evening, friends, and welcome to Bedtime Biographies, where together we unwind and drift away to the stories of remarkable lives. Before we begin, if you enjoy these journeys through history, please consider subscribing and leaving a comment below telling us which historical figure you'd like to explore next. Tonight's story is different. We're not following a person, but a place, an island that holds secrets worth trillions of dollars, buried beneath ice and stone. Greenland, the world's largest island, 80% covered in ice up to 2 miles thick, home to only 57,000 people. For centuries, it seemed like a frozen wasteland at the edge of the world, valuable for nothing but seals and silence. But beneath that ice lies something extraordinary. Rare earth elements that power our modern world. The magnets in electric cars, the screens on smartphones, the turbines generating clean energy. Uranium deposits among the largest on Earth. Gold, diamonds, graphite, copper, minerals that nations would go to war over. And yet, almost all of it remains exactly where nature placed it millions of years ago. Untouched, unexploited, waiting. Why has such immense wealth stayed buried? What forces kept these treasures locked away while the world desperately needed them? This is the bedtime biography of Greenland's hidden wealth and why it remained beneath the ice. Chapter 1. When Greenland was green. 3 million years ago, long before humans walked the earth, Greenland lived up to its name. Where today only ice and rock dominate the landscape, forests once grew. Not the dense jungles of equatorial regions, but hardy northern woodlands, birch and spruce and pine stretching across rolling hills. Grasslands spread between the trees, waving in winds that came not from Arctic storms, but from temperate weather systems. The air was warmer then, perhaps only a few degrees, but those few degrees made all the difference. Animals moved through this landscape. Ancient species of camels, their forms strange to modern eyes, grazed the vegetation. Mastodons wandered the forests. Smaller creatures, early ancestors of rabbits and rodents, burrowed in soil that wasn't frozen, in earth that could sustain life year-round. The island was green and it was alive. But this Greenland held another kind of wealth, one that wouldn't be discovered for millions of years. Deep in its bedrock, the island possessed some of the oldest and richest geology on Earth. The story of Greenland's minerals begins not 3 million years ago, but 4 billion years back, when the planet itself was young. Greenland's foundation consists of Archean and early Proterozoic crystalline basement, ancient rock formed during a series of violent orogenic events, mountain-building episodes that compressed and folded the Earth's crust. These tremendous forces, sustained over eons, created the conditions for mineral deposition. Gold settled in veins and fractures. Rubies formed under pressure. Graphite crystallized in the metamorphic processes. Then came the rifting. For hundreds of millions of years, Greenland was part of a larger supercontinent, connected to what would become Northern Europe and North America. About 500 million years ago, this landmass began to break apart. The process was slow. Geological time operates on scales that make human history seem like a heartbeat, but inexorable. Cracks formed in the continental crust. Magma rose through the fissures. The rifting created something precious, rare earth elements. These 17 metals, with names like neodymium, dysprosium, terbium, lanthanum, concentrated in specific geological formations as the continental plates separated. In southern Greenland, particularly in what geologists would later call the Gardar province, the conditions aligned perfectly. Peralkaline intrusions forced their way through older rock. Nepheline syenite formations crystallized. Within these formations, Rare earth minerals, steenstrapine, eudialyte, and others, accumulated in grades that would one day be considered economically significant. But the rifting wasn't finished. Between 60 and 65 million years ago, another dramatic event occurred. As the North Atlantic Ocean continued opening, Greenland passed over the Iceland hotspot, a massive upwelling of magma from deep within the Earth's mantle. This passage left its mark in spectacular fashion. Volcanic activity surged. Flood basalts covered portions of eastern and western Greenland. The intense heat and pressure created additional mineral deposits: copper, zinc, lead in sedimentary basins, molybdenum, platinum, and other precious metals in igneous intrusions. Even uranium concentrated in these formations, particularly in association with the rare earth deposits. The radioactive element, formed billions of years earlier in the death throes of ancient stars and scattered through the early Earth, became trapped in the same geological structures that held the rare earths. This association, uranium and rare earths together, would matter greatly, though not for millions of years. For now, the island continued its slow geological evolution. Diamond-bearing kimberlite pipes forced their way up from the mantle depths, bringing with them the crystallized carbon formed under unimaginable pressures far below. Graphite deposits formed and reformed. Iron ore beds accumulated. Tantalum, niobium, tungsten, metals that would one day be classified as critical minerals, settled into the rock formations. All of this wealth lay scattered through Greenland's crust, invisible, inaccessible, unknown. The forests grew above it, unaware. The ancient animals grazed and hunted, their feet treading stone that contained fortunes. And then, 3 million years ago, the climate began to change. Atmospheric carbon dioxide levels started dropping. The reasons were complex. Shifts in ocean currents, changes in the Earth's orbital parameters, the arrangement of continents affecting heat distribution. But the effect was clear and dramatic. Temperatures fell, summers grew shorter, winters stretched longer and colder. Snow that fell one winter didn't entirely melt the following summer. The next winter's snow accumulated on top of it. Year after year, century after century, millennium after millennium, the snow piled higher. Under its own weight, the deeper layers compressed. Snow became firn, then solid glacial ice. The ice sheet was forming. The forests died first, unable to survive the shortened growing seasons. The animals either migrated south or perished. The grasslands disappeared under snow that never melted. Within a few thousand years, an eye blink in geological time, the green island had become white. The ice spread outward from the central highlands, flowing like a river in slow motion, advancing perhaps a few meters per year. It grew thicker, hundreds of meters, then thousands. Eventually, the ice sheet covered 80% of the island, in places reaching depths of more than 3,000 meters. Nearly 2 miles of ice, pressing down with unimaginable weight. Beneath it all, frozen in darkness, the minerals waited. Chapter 2. The Ice Stone. In a modest laboratory at the Royal Veterinary and Agricultural College, Danish veterinarian and physician Peter Christian Abildgaard bent over his workbench, examining a peculiar specimen by candlelight. The rock sample before him was unlike anything he had encountered in his years of study. It was pale, almost translucent, with a waxy luster that caught the flickering flame. When he lifted it, the weight felt wrong, too light for its size. The sample had arrived from Greenland through an unusual chain of custody. Local Inuit had given it to Danish traders, mentioning that they sometimes used the soft, crumbling stone for washing animal hides. It had a peculiar property, they said, though Abildgaard couldn't quite understand what they meant until he conducted his first experiment. He filled a glass vessel with water and carefully lowered the pale stone into it. The rock seemed to vanish. Not completely. It was still there, still solid, but it became nearly invisible in the water, as though it had transformed into liquid itself. Abildgaard lifted it out, watched water stream from its surface, then submerged it again. Again, it disappeared from view. The refractive index of the mineral was almost identical to water. Light passed through both substances at the same angle, creating an optical illusion that defied common sense. He tested its other properties. The stone was soft, easily scratched with a knife. It had a hardness of about 2.5 to 3 on Mohs scale, softer than most common minerals. When heated, it melted at an unusually low temperature for a rock, around 1,000 degrees Celsius. The molten material had a peculiar opalescent quality. Abildgaard recorded his observations carefully. He noted the color, white to grayish, sometimes with reddish tinges. The crystal structure, prismatic, monoclinic. The specific gravity, approximately 2.95, lighter than most minerals. But what was it? What was its composition? Where exactly had it come from? He could not answer these questions definitively, but he could give it a name. Drawing on his classical education, he combined two Greek words, cryos, meaning frost or ice, and lithos, meaning stone. Cryolite, the ice stone. He published his findings, noting that the mineral had been obtained from Greenland through the Inuit, though the precise location remained unknown. The paper circulated among European scientists, a curiosity from the far north, but nothing more. No one yet understood what this discovery would mean. 8 years passed. In 1806, a very different man arrived in Greenland with a very different purpose. Carl Ludwig Giesecke, born Johann Georg Metzler in Augsburg, Germany, had lived several lives before his Arctic journey. He had been an actor, a mineralogist, a librettist, who possibly contributed to Mozart's The Magic Flute, and a man constantly reinventing himself. Now, working under commission from the Danish government, he had been tasked with surveying Greenland's natural resources as part of a broader colonial mapping effort. Giesecke was methodical and thorough. He traveled the southern fjords through the brief summer months, documenting geological formations, collecting samples, interviewing the Inuit about minerals and ore deposits. The work was demanding, the weather unpredictable, the terrain unforgiving, the isolation profound. But Giesecke possessed the particular combination of scientific curiosity and physical endurance required for such expeditions. In the late summer, while exploring the coastline near what would later be called Ivitut, local Inuit guides showed him something. They led him to an outcrop along the granite shore, where a coarse, pale deposit lay embedded in the rock. The mineral had that same waxy texture Abildgaard had described, the same peculiar lightness. When Giesecke placed a fragment in water from the fjord, it became nearly invisible. This was the source. This was where the ice stone came from. Giesecke carefully documented the location, though he acknowledged later that he had not discovered it through geological deduction, but through indigenous knowledge. The Inuit had known about this mineral for generations, perhaps centuries. They had found uses for it, understood its properties in their own way. Now Western science was catching up to what local knowledge had long understood. He collected samples, noted the geological context. The mineral appeared to be associated with a specific intrusive complex, a pegmatite formation that had crystallized from molten rock millions of years earlier. The deposit seemed substantial, though Giesecke could not assess its full extent. Much of it extended underground, and he had neither the time nor the equipment for detailed exploration. When Giesecke returned to Denmark, he brought his samples and his detailed notes. He published his findings, confirming that Abildgaard's cryolite had a fixed, identifiable source in southwestern Greenland. The scientific community took note, but still, the discovery remained primarily academic. Cryolite was rare and interesting, certainly. But what use did it have? Why would anyone need this peculiar ice stone from the frozen north? For nearly 50 years, no good answer presented itself. The samples sat in museums and university collections across Europe. Mineralogists occasionally examined them, wrote papers describing their properties, debated their exact chemical composition. Eventually, through careful analysis, scientists determined that cryolite was sodium aluminum fluoride, Na3AlF6, an unusual combination of common elements arranged in an uncommon way. The mineral remained a curiosity, beautiful, strange, scientifically interesting, but economically worthless. In Greenland, the deposit at Ivitut continued its long existence undisturbed. Waves lapping against the granite shore, ice forming each winter and melting each spring, the pale stone waiting in darkness for someone to imagine a purpose for it. That imagination would come from a soot-darkened laboratory in Copenhagen, where a Danish chemist was trying to solve a very different problem, and would accidentally unlock the first chapter of Greenland's industrial history. Chapter 3. The Aluminum Revolution, Copenhagen, 1853, the laboratory of Julius Thomsen. In a soot-darkened room at the College of Advanced Technology, Danish chemist Julius Thomsen watched steam hiss through a ceramic crucible. Inside the vessel, heated to extreme temperatures, cryolite from Greenland mixed with crushed limestone in a violent chemical reaction. White residue formed at the bottom, sodium carbonate, also known as soda or soda ash. The process was inefficient. The costs were high, but it worked. Thomsen understood what this meant. Across Europe, demand for sodium carbonate had surged beyond anything previous generations had known. The Industrial Revolution consumed soda in astonishing quantities. Glassmakers needed it. Textile manufacturers required it for dyeing and bleaching. Soap production depended on it. Chemical industries used it as a fundamental building block for countless processes. Until now, soda had been produced through various methods, all with limitations. The Leblanc process, dominant for decades, was expensive and produced toxic byproducts. The Solvay process, newer and cleaner, still required specific raw materials not available everywhere. Thomsen's cryolite method offered another option, not necessarily better than existing techniques, but viable, and importantly, it created demand for Greenland's seemingly useless mineral. He filed for a patent in 1853. The approval came swiftly. Within a year, Danish-backed crews arrived at Ivitut. The year was 1854, and formal extraction began. The early operations were modest by later standards. Workers arrived by ship during the brief ice-free months, typically July through October. They used hand tools initially, picks, shovels, crowbars, to break the cryolite from its matrix in the granite. The mineral was softer than the surrounding rock, which made extraction easier, but the work remained brutal. Arctic weather, even in summer, could turn violent without warning. Fog rolled in from the sea. Rain fell in cold sheets. Wind howled across the exposed workings. The men lived in rough shelters near the quarry. Food came by ship, preserved in salt or dried. Fresh water flowed from streams fed by melting ice. At night, they gathered around stoves, playing cards, writing letters home that might not be posted for months. Loneliness pressed in like the cold. But they were not entirely alone. Inuit families came during summer months, camping near the work site as they had done for generations. Some worked for the mining company. Others maintained their traditional patterns, hunting seals, fishing the fjord, gathering birds' eggs from cliff faces. Two cultures existed side by side, each following their own rhythms, occasionally intersecting. The cryolite production increased gradually. By the 1860s, regular shipments left Ivitut for Denmark and beyond. In 1864, the Danish company Cryolite Mine og Handelsselskabet received a monopoly on cryolite production. The operation formalized. More permanent structures appeared, a processing facility, storage buildings, better housing for workers. A small community began to take shape on the rocky shore. The Pennsylvania Salt Manufacturing Company in the United States became a major customer, using Greenlandic cryolite to produce caustic soda and fluorine compounds, including hydrofluoric acid. The trade was steady, but not spectacular. Cryolite remained a specialized industrial mineral, valuable but not precious, useful but not irreplaceable. Then came 1884, and everything changed. In that year, working independently on different continents, two young men made the same discovery. Charles Martin Hall, a 22-year-old American, and Paul Héroult, a 23-year-old Frenchman, both developed an electrolytic process for extracting aluminum from its ore. The Hall-Héroult process, as it came to be known, revolutionized aluminum production. But the process required something specific, a flux, to lower the melting point of aluminum oxide and increase its electrical conductivity. Various substances had been tried. Only one worked efficiently: cryolite. The implications rippled outward from those laboratories like waves from a stone dropped in still water. Aluminum, lightweight, corrosion-resistant, increasingly valuable, could now be produced commercially, but only if sufficient cryolite could be obtained. And cryolite existed in commercial quantities in exactly one place on Earth: Ivitut, Greenland. Suddenly, this remote Arctic mining operation became strategically significant. Demand exploded. Ships arrived at Ivitut with increasing frequency during the navigation season. The workforce expanded. Danish engineers arrived to improve efficiency. New equipment came north: mechanical crushers, better sorting facilities, more sophisticated extraction methods. The operation that had employed a few dozen men in the 1850s now required hundreds during peak season. A proper town emerged. Streets were laid out, though they remained unpaved. Houses were built in rows, simple wooden structures, painted in bright colors against the gray landscape. A company store opened, a schoolhouse for workers' children, a small chapel, a post office, a cemetery on the hillside overlooking the fjord, where those who died far from home found their final rest. The social fabric grew more complex. Danish administrators and engineers occupied the better houses. Skilled workers, mechanics, blacksmiths, explosives experts formed a middle tier. Unskilled laborers, including Greenlanders, lived in more basic accommodations. Women arrived, though far fewer than men, wives of senior staff, nurses, cooks, laundresses. Children played among the mining equipment, growing up in this strange hybrid of industrial site and Arctic settlement. The work continued year-round now, though winter remained challenging. When the fjord froze, supply ships couldn't reach Ivitut. Everything needed for winter operations had to be stockpiled during the brief summer. Food, fuel, equipment, spare parts, medical supplies. The community became an island within an island, ice-locked and isolated from November through May. But the cryolite kept moving. Even in winter, stockpiled mineral waited in warehouses for the spring thaw. when ships would return and the cycle would begin again. By the turn of the century, Ivittut had become Greenland's first significant industrial operation. The aluminum revolution had given purpose to a mineral that had sat undisturbed for millions of years. Greenland's first taste of mineral wealth came not from gold or diamonds or the rare earth elements still sleeping in southern mountains, but from this peculiar ice stone that made aluminum possible. Workers at Ivittut understood they were part of something larger. The metal they helped produce, indirectly through the cryolite they extracted, was building the modern world. Aluminum appeared in new applications almost monthly: cookware, building materials, electrical transmission lines, and soon, though they couldn't know it yet, something that would make Ivittut truly indispensable: aircraft. The mining continued. The ships came and went. The small town persisted on its remote shore, processing its singular mineral, contributing its small but essential part to industrial civilization. Beneath the ice sheet to the north, Greenland's other minerals, vastly more abundant, infinitely more valuable, remained untouched, unknown, waiting. Chapter 4. The Weight of Ice. While Ivittut thrived on its southern shore, the vast interior of Greenland remained as mysterious and forbidding as ever. The ice sheet dominated everything. From the air, though few had yet seen it from such a vantage, it appeared as an endless expanse of white, slightly domed, stretching from horizon to horizon. On the ground, its scale defied comprehension. Explorers standing at its edge saw only the beginning of something that extended farther than the eye could see, farther than the mind could easily grasp. Scientists in the late 19th and early 20th centuries began to understand what they were confronting. The Greenland ice sheet covered approximately 1.7 million square kilometers, an area roughly the size of Mexico, or 3 times the size of Texas. It extended 1,280 miles from north to south. In places, the ice reached thicknesses of more than 3,300 meters, over 2 miles of frozen water, compressed over millennia into solid glacial ice. The weight was almost incomprehensible. The ice sheet pressed down on the bedrock beneath with such force that much of Greenland's interior had been pushed below sea level. The land itself had deformed under the burden, creating a saucer-like depression. If the ice were somehow removed, the island's center would lie beneath the waves until, slowly, over thousands of years, the rock would rebound upward, freed from its frozen load. In 1888, Norwegian explorer Fridtjof Nansen made the first known crossing of the ice sheet. He and his party set out from the east coast near Angmagssalik, skiing westward toward Godthaab on the west coast. The journey took weeks of grueling effort. They hauled sledges across ice that was sometimes smooth, sometimes broken into treacherous crevasses hidden beneath thin snow bridges. The temperature dropped to punishing depths. Wind scoured their faces. The monotony of endless white played tricks on the mind. But Nansen succeeded, proving that the ice sheet could be crossed. His account, published afterward, captured both the grandeur and the terrible hostility of the environment. This was not merely difficult terrain. This was a landscape that actively resisted human presence, that seemed designed to repel intrusion. Other explorers followed. Robert Peary, the American who claimed to have reached the North Pole, made multiple expeditions to Greenland's northern reaches. Danish explorer Knud Rasmussen, born in Greenland to a Danish father and Inuit mother, combined scientific observation with indigenous knowledge, mapping routes and documenting conditions. Each expedition added to the understanding of the ice sheet's vastness and complexity. Yet crossing the ice was one thing. Accessing what lay beneath it was another matter entirely. By the early 1900s, geologists understood that valuable minerals likely existed under the ice sheet, just as they existed in the ice-free coastal regions. The same geological processes that had created the known deposits along the coasts would have operated throughout the island. Logic suggested that rare minerals, metallic ores, perhaps even precious stones, lay buried under that frozen blanket. But how could anyone reach them? How could anyone even survey what existed beneath 2 miles of ice? The technology didn't exist. Drilling through such depths was impossible with the equipment of the era. Geophysical survey methods were still primitive. Ground-penetrating radar wouldn't be developed for decades. Even if someone could somehow determine what minerals lay beneath a particular section of ice, extracting them would require moving or melting unimaginable quantities of frozen water. The economics made no sense. The practical challenges were insurmountable, and so the ice guarded its secrets. The sheet moved slowly but constantly, flowing outward from its central dome like honey spreading across a tilted surface, though its speeds measured in meters per year rather than minutes. This movement ground against the bedrock beneath, polishing some areas, plucking rocks from others, but generally preserving the underlying landscape in a state of frozen suspension. In some places, the ice was cold-based, frozen to the bedrock, immobile at its bottom even while upper layers flowed. These cold-based regions preserved whatever lay beneath them almost perfectly. In 2014, scientists would discover soil at the base of an ice core that was 2.7 million years old, preserved exactly as it had been before the ice sheet formed. Ancient tundra, frozen in time, complete with plant material and evidence of the ecosystem that once existed. If soil could survive so long, so could mineral deposits, sealed away in darkness and cold, waiting. Along the margins of the ice sheet, where the frozen mass met the sea, massive outlet glaciers calved icebergs into the ocean. Jakobshavn Isbrae in western Greenland produced so many icebergs that early European explorers had named the bay Ilulissat, icebergs in the Greenlandic language. These glaciers moved faster than the main ice sheet, sometimes tens of meters per day during surge events. They carried rock and debris from the interior, grinding it down, eventually depositing it far out at sea. Geologists studied these deposits, looking for clues about what lay inland. The glacial sediments contained traces of various minerals, hints of the geological wealth trapped beneath the ice. But traces were not deposits. Hints were not locations. The ice kept its treasures hidden. At Ivitut, workers continued extracting cryolite, unaware that the true scale of Greenland's mineral wealth lay not in their accessible coastal deposit, but beneath the vast white emptiness that dominated the island's interior. The ice sheet, formed 3 million years ago, had become both preservationist and prison warden, protecting and concealing in equal measure. The minerals waited in their frozen vault as they had for eons, as they would for decades more. Chapter 5. Wartime Urgency, April 9, 1940. Nazi Germany invaded Denmark. The news reached Ivitut by radio, crackling across thousands of miles of ocean. Denmark had fallen in hours, its small military overwhelmed by the Wehrmacht. King Christian VI remained in Copenhagen, now under German occupation. The Danish government, such as it still existed, had no power to protect its distant Arctic colony. At Ivitut, the implications were immediately clear. The cryolite mine had become, overnight, a strategic asset in enemy territory. Without cryolite, aluminum production would halt. Without aluminum, aircraft production would halt. Without aircraft, the war, already begun in Europe, though America had not yet entered, could not be fought. The Allies understood this. So did the Germans. The United States moved quickly. In April 1941, though still officially neutral, American forces arrived in Greenland under an agreement with the exiled Danish ambassador in Washington. The mission? Protect the cryolite mine at all costs. By September 1940, even before formal base construction began, American military personnel had taken up positions around Ivitut. The transformation was dramatic. A mining town of a few hundred civilians suddenly became a military installation. American soldiers arrived by ship, eventually 500 men, heavily armed, with orders to prevent any German attempt to capture or destroy the facility. Machine gun emplacements appeared on strategic hilltops overlooking the fjord. Large naval guns were positioned to target any submarine that might attempt to enter the harbor. Searchlights swept the waters at night. Patrol boats circled the area during the ice-free months. Security became absolute. No photographs could be taken anywhere in Ivitut. The location, the facilities, even the faces of workers, all became classified information. No one could write letters to family or friends. The fear was real and specific. If the Germans intercepted any communication revealing details about the mine's defenses, its production capacity, or its exact location, they might launch an operation to seize or sabotage it. The miners worked under this strange new regime. Danish, Canadian, and American workers labored side by side in the quarry, now knowing that their work directly impacted the war effort. The cryolite they extracted would become aluminum in North American smelters. That aluminum would become aircraft, bombers, fighters, transport planes. Those aircraft would face German Luftwaffe over the skies of Europe. Production intensified. In 1942, the mine reached its peak output, 86,000 tons shipped to the United States and Canada. Ships arrived more frequently during the navigation season, loaded quickly under military supervision, and departed under naval escort. The entire operation became a carefully choreographed dance of extraction, transportation, and protection. The Greenlandic population experienced the war differently. Indigenous Greenlanders, primarily women, worked in the kitchens and mess halls, preparing meals for the expanded workforce. Others worked as housekeepers and nannies in the homes of senior staff. They observed the military buildup, the urgent production schedules, the tension that now permeated the community. But they remained somewhat separate from it all, continuing their traditional activities when time and circumstance allowed. On April 1, 1943, the Americans formalized their presence by establishing Base Bluey West 7 nearby at Kangelinguit. The base provided logistics, supply, and additional security for the mining operation. Barracks were built. A proper airstrip was constructed. Radio towers went up. The American military presence in southwestern Greenland became permanent for the duration of the war. Throughout these years, no German attack came. Whether the defenses deterred an attempt, or whether Germany never seriously planned an assault on such a remote target, remains unclear. But the possibility was real enough to justify the massive investment in protection. By war's end in 1945, Ivitut had produced hundreds of thousands of tons of cryolite, all of it flowing into the Allied war machine. The aluminum made possible, the aircraft, the vehicles, the equipment, had helped win the Battle of Britain, had supported the bombing campaign against Germany, had enabled the massive industrial production that ultimately overwhelmed the Axis powers. A small Arctic mining town had played its part in the great conflict. Greenland's strategic importance, so long theoretical, had been proven in the most dramatic way possible. Chapter 6. The Silent Closure. After the war ended, a strange quiet settled over Ivitut. The American soldiers departed. leaving behind empty barracks and gun emplacements that would slowly rust in the salt air. Base Bluey West 7 was handed over to Danish control and renamed Kangelinguit. The searchlights went dark. The patrol boats ceased their endless circling. Security restrictions eased. People could photograph the town again, could write letters home without military censors reading every word. Life returned to something resembling its pre-war pattern, though nothing was quite the same. The Danish company Kriolitselskabet Øresund resumed full control of mining operations. The workforce adjusted to peacetime rhythms, still demanding, still difficult, but without the urgent pressure of wartime production quotas. Ships continued arriving each summer, loading cryolite, departing for aluminum smelters in Europe and North America. The global economy was rebuilding, and aluminum remained essential for that reconstruction. For a time, Ivitut prospered. The war had demonstrated the mine's importance, and the post-war world needed aluminum for peaceful purposes now: construction, consumer goods, electrical infrastructure. Demand remained strong through the late 1940s and 1950s. The population of Ivitut grew to include more families. Children attended the school. The small community maintained its peculiar existence, industrial and remote, modern and isolated, connected to global supply chains, yet separated from the world by cold water and distance. Some of the profits from these prosperous years went toward establishing Greenland's Fly, which would eventually become Air Greenland, the national airline. The cryolite mine, in this indirect way, helped connect Greenland to the outside world through aviation, a fitting legacy, perhaps, given that cryolite's main use had been producing aluminum for aircraft. But beneath this surface stability, change was coming. In the 1950s, chemists and industrial engineers began perfecting methods to synthesize cryolite artificially. The process involved combining aluminum fluoride with sodium fluoride and other compounds in carefully controlled conditions. The synthetic version functioned identically to natural cryolite in aluminum smelting. More importantly, it could be produced anywhere, near the smelters themselves, eliminating the need for long-distance shipping from a remote Arctic location. The economics shifted quietly but decisively. Natural cryolite from Ivitut cost more to extract and transport than synthetic cryolite cost to manufacture locally. As synthetic production facilities came online through the late 1950s and early 1960s, orders from Ivitut began to decline. The mine managers understood what was happening. They implemented cost-cutting measures. They improved efficiency. They explored deeper into the deposit, looking for higher-grade ore, but these efforts only delayed the inevitable. The unique value that Ivitut had possessed, being the only source of commercial cryolite, had evaporated with the development of artificial substitutes. By the early 1960s, the decision became unavoidable. Active mining operations ceased. The workers who had been employed year-round received notices. Many left immediately, returning to Denmark or moving to other settlements in Greenland. Others stayed on in reduced capacities, processing existing stockpiles. The town began its slow contraction. Houses that had been filled with families stood empty. The school had fewer students each year. The company store reduced its inventory. Ships arrived less frequently, and when they did come, they carried smaller crews and left more quickly. The sense of purpose that had animated Ivitut for over a century began to fade. Still, the complete end didn't come immediately. Large stockpiles of processed cryolite remained in the warehouses, and these continued to be shipped through the 1960s and 1970s. The operation entered a strange twilight period, no longer truly active, but not yet completely finished. A skeleton crew maintained the facilities. Occasional shipments departed for customers who still preferred natural cryolite or who had long-standing contracts. The 1970s passed, then the 1980s began. The stockpiles diminished. The remaining workers aged. The buildings weathered under Arctic conditions, paint peeling, wood warping, metal corroding in the salt air. Fewer and fewer ships bothered to make the journey. Finally, in 1987, the end arrived without drama or ceremony. The last shipment of cryolite left Ivitut's harbor. No grand announcement was made. No memorial was erected. The mine simply closed. The company informed the remaining workers that operations had concluded. People packed their belongings and left. Within a few years, Ivitut was essentially abandoned. A few individuals remained, using the old buildings as temporary shelter during hunting expeditions, but no permanent population stayed. The town that had once housed hundreds became a ghost settlement, structures still standing but empty, streets silent, the rhythm of industrial activity replaced by wind and the cries of seabirds. The massive pit where cryolite had been extracted for 133 years slowly filled with water, rainwater, snowmelt, groundwater seeping through fractures in the rock. The water was remarkably clear, reflecting the gray sky, turning the excavation into a strange glacial lake. Around its edges, chunks of cryolite still lay scattered where they had been dropped or discarded. White fragments that seemed to glow against the dark stone, invisible when rain puddles formed around them. The cemetery on the hillside remained the most carefully maintained area. Here lay those who had died far from home. Danish engineers, workers from various nations, a few Greenlanders who had been part of the mining community. The graves stood in neat rows, marked by simple crosses and stones, overlooking the fjord where ships no longer came. Estimates suggest that the Ivitut mine had contributed somewhere near 54 billion euros to the Danish economy over its century of operation, though this figure has been disputed and debated. Some argue the number is inflated, pointing out that extraction costs, transportation expenses, and infrastructure investments would have consumed much of the revenue. Others contend the calculation doesn't account for all the economic multiplier effects, the jobs created, the industries supported, the technological advances enabled. Regardless of the exact figure, Ivitut had been profitable. The cryolite had value. For 133 years, Greenland's first major mineral operation had extracted wealth from the Arctic and sent it south. And now it was over. The buildings stood empty. The machinery rusted. The pit filled with water. The unique mineral that had made Ivitut important had been replaced by chemistry and industrial processes that needed no remote Arctic mine. But beneath the ice sheet to the north, and in the mountains of southern Greenland, other minerals waited, vastly more abundant, infinitely more valuable. The rare earth elements, the uranium, the diamonds, the gold, none of these had yet been touched. Greenland's real mineral wealth remained exactly where geological processes had placed it millions of years ago. Undiscovered, unexploited, waiting. Chapter 7. The Sleeping Giants. While Ivitut faded into silence, scientists had been quietly cataloging Greenland's other treasures. The first hints had come surprisingly early. In 1806, the same year Carl Ludwig Giesecke identified the cryolite deposit, he had documented other unusual minerals during his surveys of southern Greenland. At a place called Ilimausak, he found and described 3 rare minerals, arvedsonite, eudialyte, and sodalite. He noted their peculiar properties, collected samples, recorded their locations in his meticulous field notes. Giesecke couldn't have known what he was looking at. The concept of rare earth elements wouldn't be fully developed for another century. The minerals he documented contained these elements, locked within their crystal structures, but the significance remained hidden. His samples went to museums. His notes were filed away. The minerals at Illimausak continued their existence undisturbed. More than a century passed before anyone looked more carefully. In the 1950s, as the Cold War intensified and nuclear technology became strategically vital, geological surveys took on new urgency. Nations wanted to know where uranium could be found. They wanted to map potential ore bodies. They wanted to understand their own resources and, perhaps more importantly, understand what resources their rivals might possess. Greenland, nominally controlled by NATO member Denmark, became part of this mapping effort. In the mid-1950s, survey teams arrived with new technology. Airborne gamma-ray spectrometers that could detect radioactive signatures from aircraft flying over the terrain. Ground-based scintillometric equipment measured radiation more precisely at specific sites. The surveys were systematic, comprehensive, covering thousands of square kilometers of ice-free coastal areas. In 1956, instruments detected strong radiometric anomalies at Kvanefjeld, in the same general region where Giesecke had worked 150 years earlier. The readings indicated significant concentrations of radioactive elements. Follow-up investigations began in the 1960s, with drilling programs in the 1970s to assess what lay beneath the surface. The results were remarkable. Kvanefjeld contained not just uranium, though uranium was certainly present in substantial quantities, but also massive concentrations of rare earth elements. The two occurred together in the same geological formation, co-located in minerals like steenstrupine and eudialyte. The deposit appeared to be vast, potentially one of the largest rare earth accumulations on Earth. But what were rare earth elements? Even in the 1970s, their importance remained somewhat obscure outside specialized scientific and industrial circles. They were a group of 17 metallic elements with names that seemed designed to confuse: lanthanum, cerium, praseodymium, neodymium, samarium, europium, gadolinium, terbium, dysprosium, holmium, erbium, thulium, ytterbium, lutetium, plus scandium, and yttrium. Despite the name, they weren't particularly rare in the Earth's crust. They just rarely concentrated in economically viable deposits. Their uses in the 1970s were limited, some applications in glass coloring, certain metallurgical processes, specialized magnets. Nothing that would drive major mining investments in one of the world's most remote and expensive locations. The surveys documented Kvanefjeld's potential, but no one rushed to develop it. The timing wasn't right. The economics didn't work. Other discoveries followed. Diamond-bearing kimberlite pipes were identified in the Sisimiut-Sarfartok-Maniitsoq area of western Greenland during the 1970s. Kimberlites are remarkable geological formations, volcanic pipes that originate deep in the Earth's mantle and sometimes carry diamonds upward during explosive eruptions. Finding kimberlites doesn't guarantee finding diamonds, but it creates possibility. Geologists found graphite deposits scattered across various regions, thick formations of crystallized carbon, valuable for industrial applications, battery production, metallurgy. Copper occurrences were documented, zinc, lead, gold in various locations, platinum, molybdenum. The list grew longer with each survey season. In eastern Greenland, researchers identified what appeared to be a placer deposit on Milne land. Heavy minerals concentrated by ancient river systems, including monazite rich in rare earth elements. The deposit dated to the Jurassic period, formed as the Atlantic Ocean was opening. Each discovery was documented, samples were collected, reports were filed. But documentation is not development. Scientific interest is not economic investment. The surveys revealed that Greenland possessed extraordinary geological diversity. Mineralization processes spanning billions of years had created deposits of almost every valuable commodity. Yet none of it, beyond the steadily exhausting cryolite, was being extracted. Why? The reasons were multiple and reinforcing. Infrastructure remained minimal. Transportation costs were extreme. Most deposits were in remote areas, accessible only by ship or helicopter, and then only during certain months. Processing technology for many of the minerals, particularly the rare earths in their unusual eudialyte host rock, was underdeveloped or non-existent. The global market for many of these minerals remained small. And most significantly, other sources existed in more accessible locations. Why invest billions in Arctic mining operations when copper could be mined more cheaply in Chile? Why pursue Greenland's gold when deposits in Australia or Canada were easier to reach? Why attempt to extract rare earths from technically challenging Greenlandic ore when China was beginning to dominate global production with its more easily processed deposits? The economic logic was clear and unforgiving. Greenland's minerals were real, substantial, valuable in absolute terms, but not competitive in relative terms. Not yet. So the sleeping giants remained asleep. The uranium and rare earths at Kvanefjeld, the diamonds in the kimberlites, the graphite, the gold, all documented, all known to science, all waiting for conditions to change. Chapter 8. The Gardar Province. By the early 2000s, the world was changing in ways that would finally matter for Greenland's hidden minerals. The technology revolution accelerated. Cell phones became ubiquitous, then transformed into smartphones, devices that required dozens of different elements in their construction. Wind turbines proliferated as renewable energy gained momentum. Electric vehicles transitioned from experimental curiosities to commercial products. Each of these technologies depended on permanent magnets made from rare earth elements, particularly neodymium and dysprosium. Suddenly, these obscure elements with difficult names became strategically critical, and suddenly Greenland's deposits looked different. The focus intensified on southern Greenland's Gardar Province, a geological region formed during the Mesoproterozoic era, roughly 1,300 million years ago. Here, peralkaline intrusions had created ideal conditions for rare earth concentration. The intrusions were unusual. Nepheline syenite formations enriched with sodium and potassium, deficient in silica. Within these formations, rare earth minerals had crystallized in commercially significant grades. 3 deposits stood out above all others: Kvanefjeld, Kringlerne, and Tanbreez. Kvanefjeld, also known by its Greenlandic name Kvanersuit, sat on the broad plateau of the Ilimausak intrusive complex, overlooking fjords near the town of Narsak. The surveys from the 1950s through the 1990s had only hinted at its true scale. Modern exploration techniques revealed something extraordinary. The total resource at Kvanefjeld, including the main deposit plus the nearby Sorensen and Zone 3 ore bodies, was estimated at approximately 1.01 billion tons of ore. The grade averaged 1.10% total rare earth oxides. That percentage sounds small, but in context, it was significant. Many deposits being considered elsewhere showed grades below 0.5%. Some Chinese deposits had higher grades, 2.55% at Bayan Obo, and Australia's Memptweld was exceptional at 640%. but Kvanefjeld's 1.10%, and particularly the 143% in the proven ore reserve sections, was economically viable. More importantly, Kvanefjeld contained substantial quantities of heavy, rare earth elements, particularly dysprosium and terbium. These elements are more valuable than their light counterparts because they're scarcer and have unique properties essential for high-performance applications. The deposit held an estimated 370,000 metric tons of heavy rare earths. By 2015, Kvanefjeld was recognized as the third largest known land deposit of rare earth elements in the world. But there was the complication that early surveys had revealed: uranium. An estimated 270,000 tons of uranium occurred alongside the rare earths, making Kvanefjeld also the 8th largest uranium deposit on Earth. The uranium concentration averaged around 266 parts per million in the total resource, rising to 362 parts per million in the ore reserve sections. The two elements, rare earths and uranium, were intimately mixed in the same minerals, particularly steenstruppine and eudialyte. You couldn't extract one without bringing the other to the surface. In 2007, an Australian mining company called Greenland Minerals and Energy, later renamed Energy Transition Minerals, began serious exploration at Kvanefjeld. The company was methodical and patient. They conducted drilling programs to define the ore body precisely. They ran metallurgical tests to determine the best extraction methods. They completed pre-feasibility studies in the late 2000s, then full feasibility studies by 2015. The feasibility work outlined an ambitious operation: an open-pit mine with a concentrator producing flotation concentrate averaging 20–25% rare earth oxides. Byproducts would include fluorspar and zinc concentrates. A downstream refinery would separate individual rare earth products and recover uranium, which was projected to account for approximately 5% of revenues. In 2016, Chinese rare earth company Shenghe Resources took a strategic stake in the project, becoming the second largest shareholder. Shenghe signed a memorandum of understanding to lead the processing and marketing of materials extracted from the site. This partnership made sense from a technical perspective. China had decades of experience processing rare earths, but it introduced geopolitical complications that would later matter greatly. By 2018, optimized plans projected annual production of approximately 32,000 tons of rare earth oxides and 400 tons of uranium, with a mine life exceeding 35 years. The project seemed to be advancing toward development. The other major deposits in the Gardar province followed different trajectories. Kringlerne, part of the same Illimausak complex, showed promising grades but remained less developed. The rare earth minerals occurred in layers of cacorticite, a distinctive layered intrusive rock unique to this region. The main rare earth mineral here was eudialyte, the same reddish mineral Giesecke had documented in 1806. Tanbreez, located in the same fjord network as Kvanefjeld, contained a different but equally significant deposit. The ore body held substantial quantities of eudialyte, rich in heavy rare earth elements, plus valuable concentrations of gallium, a critical element for semiconductors. Tanbreez also had an advantage. While rare earths co-occurred with tantalum, niobium, and zirconium, the uranium content was lower, potentially avoiding the complications that would plague Kvanefjeld. Tanbreez moved more slowly through the development pipeline. Preliminary economic assessment wasn't completed until 2025, but the deposit was massive. Estimates suggested resources that could rival or exceed Kvanefjeld in scale. Together, these three deposits represented a concentration of rare earth wealth matched by few other locations on Earth. The Garda province had become ground zero for speculation about Greenland's mineral future. Exploration licenses proliferated across southern Greenland in the late 2010s. By 2020, permits had been granted for the majority of the region's accessible areas. Mining companies from Australia, Canada, China, the United States, and Europe had staked claims, conducted surveys, drilled exploratory holes. The sleeping giants were waking up, or rather, people were finally paying attention to them, finally seeing their value, finally willing to consider the enormous investments and technical challenges required to develop them. But attention and willingness don't guarantee success. The hardest parts of the story were yet to come. The collision between economic potential and environmental concern, between development dreams and community fears, between global demand and local determination. Chapter 9. The Cost of Cold. The rare earth deposits were real, the demand was real, the value was indisputable. Yet by the 2020s, despite decades of exploration and billions of dollars in preliminary investment, not a single rare earth mine operated in Greenland. The obstacles were formidable, compounding upon each other in ways that made even the most promising projects economically marginal. Start with temperature. Greenland's climate imposes costs that mining operations in temperate zones never face. Concrete and asphalt, the foundations of roads and processing facilities, cannot form properly in extreme cold. They crack and fail under freeze-thaw cycles. Building durable infrastructure requires specialized construction techniques and materials that cost multiples of what would be spent elsewhere. Steel becomes brittle, hydraulic fluids thicken. Machinery fails in ways engineers in warmer climates never encounter. Then consider the infrastructure that doesn't exist. Greenland possesses exactly 93 miles of paved road, total for the entire island. No railways connect any settlements. The 16 ports scattered around the coast have limited capacity, designed for fishing vessels and small cargo ships, not the massive bulk carriers that modern mining operations require. Nuuk, the capital and largest port, handled 2 million tons of cargo in 2021. A single large mine might produce several times that annually. Every piece of equipment must arrive by ship or aircraft. Every fuel tank, every vehicle, every structural beam, every replacement part. During the brief ice-free season, typically July through October, ships can reach most coastal locations. Outside that window, access depends on helicopters or, if ice conditions permit, reinforced vessels capable of breaking through sea ice. These limitations compress the construction season brutally. What might take 1 year to build in Australia could require 3 or 4 years in Greenland. Energy presents another challenge. Remote mine sites have no connection to electrical grids because no grids exist outside the small towns. Everything must be diesel generated, with fuel shipped in at enormous expense. Mining and processing rare earths is energy intensive. Crushing ore, chemical separation, refining, all consuming electricity continuously. Running these operations on diesel power makes them less competitive against mines in regions with cheap hydroelectric or grid power. Transportation costs can exceed mining costs. Industry analyses suggest Arctic operations cost 3 to 5 times more than equivalent projects in temperate regions. Moving equipment and concentrates in Greenland's conditions, limited ports, seasonal access, harsh weather, typically cost 30 to 50% more than temperate equivalents. For bulk commodities like rare earth concentrates, transportation costs directly impact profitability. Labor compounds these difficulties. Greenland has a population of 57,000 people. As of 2020, only 65 individuals worked in mining across the entire country. The specialized skills required for modern mining operations, geologists, metallurgists, heavy equipment operators, explosives experts, processing engineers, simply aren't available locally in sufficient numbers. Mining companies must recruit internationally, which means not just paying competitive wages, but also covering transportation, housing, and rotation schedules for workers who fly in for weeks or months at a time. Building a mine in Greenland means building a town, worker accommodations, medical facilities, food service, recreation areas, communication systems, emergency response capabilities. Everything must be created from nothing in locations where no infrastructure exists. The capital investment required before the first ton of ore is processed becomes staggering. The geology itself presents technical challenges unique to Greenland. The rare earth elements occur primarily in eudialyte, a complex silicate mineral that has never been processed commercially at large scale anywhere in the world. Traditional rare earth processing methods were developed for carbonatite ores, chemically simpler, easier to break down. Processing eudialyte requires different chemistry, specialized equipment, techniques still being refined through pilot programs. No one has proven the process works economically at commercial scale. Permafrost adds another layer of complexity. The permanently frozen ground that underlies much of Greenland requires special foundation designs, thermosiphons to prevent heat from thawing the ground beneath structures, elevated buildings to allow cold air circulation, constant monitoring and maintenance. Climate change makes this worse, not better. Active layer thaw, the seasonal melting of the surface layer, is projected to increase by 1 to 3 meters by 2050, fundamentally altering ground conditions and requiring expensive adaptations. All of these factors combine mathematically. Each additional cost multiplies against the others. A project that might be marginally profitable in Chile or Australia becomes deeply unprofitable in Greenland. The minerals are there, abundant and valuable, but locked away not just by ice, but by the cruel arithmetic of Arctic economics. Chapter 10. The China Shadow. In 2010, a shipping dispute in the East China Sea changed everything. A Chinese fishing trawler collided with Japanese Coast Guard vessels near the disputed Senkaku Islands. Japan arrested the captain. China, in response, quietly implemented export restrictions on rare earth elements to Japan. The restrictions were never officially announced, but suddenly Japanese companies found their orders delayed, their shipments blocked at Chinese ports, their supply chains disrupted. The message was unmistakable. China controlled global rare earth production, and it was willing to use that control as geopolitical leverage. The world woke up to a reality that had been decades in the making. China possessed approximately 44 million metric tons of rare earth reserves, nearly half of the world's estimated 91.9 million tons total. But reserves were only part of the story. More significantly, China controlled virtually all processing and refining capacity. Even rare earths mined in other countries typically had to be shipped to China for separation and refinement, because the necessary facilities existed nowhere else. How had this happened? The story stretched back to the 1980s and 1990s. As environmental regulations tightened in the United States and Europe, rare earth processing, which generated significant toxic waste and required careful handling of radioactive thorium byproducts, became increasingly expensive and politically difficult in Western nations. China, pursuing industrial development and less constrained by environmental concerns, welcomed the industry. Companies moved their processing operations to Chinese facilities. The technology transferred, the expertise concentrated in one country. By 2010, China produced approximately 95% of the world's rare earth supply and processed nearly 100%. Mountain Pass Mine in California, once the world's leading producer, had closed in 2002. Mines in Australia faced similar pressures. The entire global supply chain funneled through Chinese facilities. The 2010 export restrictions and similar actions in subsequent years sent shockwaves through technology and defense industries worldwide. Electric vehicle manufacturers suddenly faced supply uncertainty for the neodymium needed in motor magnets. Wind turbine producers worried about dysprosium access. Defense contractors realized that advanced weapon systems, from fighter jets to guided missiles, depended on materials controlled by a strategic rival. Governments and companies began desperately seeking alternatives. Where else in the world could rare earths be found and developed? What deposits existed outside Chinese control? Greenland's name appeared repeatedly in these assessments. The Kvanefjeld deposit, third largest in the world. Tonbree's massive reserves of heavy rare earths. The potential to supply a significant portion of Western rare earth needs. Located in NATO territory, politically stable, aligned with European and North American interests. Suddenly, the Arctic economics looked different. Yes, extraction would be expensive. Yes, the infrastructure challenges were severe. But what price could be put on supply security? On reducing dependence on a strategic competitor? On ensuring that critical technologies weren't subject to foreign export restrictions? Governments became willing to provide support that pure market economics wouldn't justify. The U.S. Defense Department identified rare earths as critical materials. The European Union designated them as strategic resources. Subsidies, loan guarantees, research funding, and regulatory assistance became available. Projects that looked unprofitable under normal circumstances might work with government backing. But even as Western nations courted Greenland's rare earth potential, China moved to maintain its influence. In 2016, Shenghe Resources, one of China's largest rare earth companies, became the second largest shareholder in Greenland Minerals, the Australian company developing Kvanefjeld. The investment was substantial and strategic. Shenghe signed memoranda of understanding to lead the processing and marketing of materials extracted from the site. The arrangement made technical sense. Shenghe had the expertise, the facilities, the established customer relationships. But it created an obvious irony. A project meant to reduce Western dependence on Chinese rare earth supply would be partly owned and processed by a Chinese company. The rare earths would still flow through Chinese facilities, still depend on Chinese technical capacity. In 2018, China escalated its Arctic presence by launching its Polar Silk Road initiative as part of the broader Belt and Road program. The policy document controversially referred to China as a near-Arctic state, a designation that puzzled geographers since China's northernmost point lies more than 1,400 kilometers from the Arctic Circle. But the intent was clear. China wanted a role in Arctic development, particularly regarding natural resources and shipping routes. Chinese companies attempted investments in Greenland's infrastructure. Proposals came forward for financing airport expansions, purchasing an abandoned naval station, building a satellite ground station. Each proposal followed similar logic: provide funding and technical assistance that Greenland needed but couldn't easily obtain elsewhere, establishing relationships and access in return. Most of these initiatives were blocked. U.S. and Danish security officials raised concerns about strategic facilities falling under Chinese control or influence. The airport expansion at Nuuk eventually received American funding instead of Chinese. The naval station acquisition was prevented. The satellite ground station proposal was rejected. By most measures, the Polar Silk Road failed to establish significant presence in Greenland. But China's dominant position in rare earth processing meant it couldn't be entirely excluded. Even U.S. officials, while lobbying against Chinese ownership of mining projects, acknowledged the reality. Without access to Chinese processing facilities, rare earth projects anywhere in the world faced severe challenges. Building new processing capacity outside China required billions in investment and years of development. The technology could be replicated, but not quickly or cheaply. This created strange dynamics. Western governments wanted to reduce dependence on Chinese rare earths, which logically meant developing alternative sources like Greenland. But developing those sources required either shipping concentrates to China for processing, perpetuating the dependence, or building entirely new processing infrastructure in Europe or North America at enormous cost. Meanwhile, Chinese companies had capital to invest and expertise to contribute. Excluding them from Greenland projects might be strategically desirable, but practically difficult. Projects with Chinese participation could move forward faster and more economically than purely Western ventures. Greenland found itself at the center of this geopolitical competition. Its rare earth deposits, still undeveloped, still mostly theoretical as actual supply sources, had become bargaining chips in a larger game. The government in Nuuk had to balance multiple pressures: the desire for economic development and the revenue that mining could provide, concern about environmental impacts, sensitivity about sovereignty, and neo-colonial dynamics. Awareness that choosing one set of foreign partners over another had strategic implications far beyond mining economics. In 2019, Greenland's Minister of Business and Mineral Resources stated the situation plainly. Western partnerships were preferred, but without an influx of investment, Greenland would have to consider other partners, including China. The warning was diplomatic but clear. Greenland's rare earths were valuable, multiple nations wanted them, and Greenland would work with whoever offered the best terms, not just financially, but in respecting the island's autonomy and environmental priorities. The minerals remained in the ground, increasingly valuable, increasingly contested, but still unextracted. The China shadow hung over every discussion of their future development. Chapter 11. The Town of Narsak. 8 kilometers from Kvanefjeld, across rolling tundra and rocky outcrops, lies the town of Narsak. Population, roughly 1,000 people. The settlement clings to the edge of a fjord in southern Greenland, houses painted in bright colors, red, yellow, blue, green, standing out against the gray-brown landscape and the darker gray of the water. In summer, wildflowers bloom in brief profusion. In winter, ice grips the fjord and snow blankets everything, the painted houses becoming almost the only color in a monochrome world. Narsak is a fishing town, primarily. Boats depart each morning when weather permits, returning with catches that sustain the local economy: halibut, cod, shrimp. The fish processing plant employs dozens. The smell of the sea permeates everything. This has been the pattern for generations, the rhythm of life determined by seasons, weather, and the movements of fish through cold waters. Some families also keep sheep, small flocks that graze the sparse vegetation during the brief summer, surviving on hay through the long winter. Sheep farming in Greenland requires particular hardiness, both in the animals and the people who tend them. The climate is marginal for agriculture, but families persist, maintaining traditions that stretch back to the Norse settlements 1,000 years ago. Others supplement their income through harvesting, berries in late summer, mushrooms when conditions are right, birds' eggs from cliff faces in spring. These activities connect people to the land in ways that feel essential, that define identity and community. The land provides. The sea provides. People take what they need, and life continues. This is what mattered to the people of Narsak when they first heard about plans to develop the Kvanefjeld mine in the 2010s. The mining company presented the project as economic opportunity. Jobs, potentially hundreds during construction, dozens permanently during operation. Tax revenue that would flow to Greenland's government. Infrastructure improvements, better roads, upgraded port facilities, reliable electricity. Investment in a region that had few other development prospects. A path toward economic diversification beyond fishing and government subsidies. But the people of Narsak had questions, concerns, fears that grew as they learned more details about what the mine would actually entail. The deposit contained uranium, 270,000 tons of it, mixed intimately with the rare earths. The company planned an open-pit operation that would, by necessity, bring radioactive material to the surface. They proposed managing it carefully, storing it securely, monitoring it constantly. But managed radiation is still radiation. Secure storage can fail. Constant monitoring requires trust in institutions and companies and systems. Water flows downhill. Narsak sits downhill from Kvanefjeld. 8 kilometers isn't far when considering groundwater, surface runoff, dust carried by wind. The fjord, where fishing boats depart each morning, would be fed by streams and rivers that flow past the mine site. The contamination risks weren't hypothetical, they were hydrological certainties if anything went wrong. People remembered legacy mines from earlier eras. A 2022 study had examined 3 old mining operations in Greenland from before the 1970s, when environmental regulations barely existed. The findings showed heavy pollution, lead, zinc, metals leaching into soil and water, persisting decades after mining ceased. The study also showed that more recent mines, operated under modern environmental standards, had caused no significant pollution. The message seemed mixed. Mining can be done cleanly now, but only if regulations are strict and enforcement is rigorous. But what about accidents? What about equipment failures, human error, corporate cost-cutting, changing ownership, bankruptcy leaving cleanup unfunded? The distance from Copenhagen, the isolation of Greenland, the limited government capacity to monitor and enforce, all of these factors made people nervous. Beyond contamination risks, people worried about dust. Mining operations generate enormous quantities of dust from blasting, crushing, hauling, processing. In Arctic environments, dust settles on snow and ice, darkening surfaces, increasing heat absorption, accelerating melting. Dust carried by wind could reach Narsak, coating surfaces, entering homes, affecting air quality. Radioactive dust, even in trace amounts, was particularly concerning. Traditional foods became part of the discussion. Many families still hunted seals, fished for Arctic char in freshwater streams, gathered berries and mushrooms, harvested seabirds. These activities provided food, but also maintained cultural connections, taught children traditional skills, reinforced identity. If water became contaminated, if wildlife populations declined, if plants absorbed pollutants from soil, all of these traditional practices would be threatened. People would have to choose between continuing cultural traditions and protecting their health. And there were broader questions about the kind of future Narsak residents wanted. The town was quiet, close-knit, safe. Children played freely. Everyone knew everyone. The pace of life followed natural rhythms, the seasons, the tides, the migration of fish and birds. An industrial mining operation would change all of this. Hundreds of workers arriving, many foreign, most men, living in temporary camps, bringing different expectations and behaviors. Increased traffic on roads not designed for heavy trucks, noise from machinery and blasting, light pollution, economic inequality between mine workers earning high wages and locals in traditional occupations. Some people in Narsak supported the mine, seeing it as necessary economic development, worth the risks and changes. They pointed to poverty, unemployment, young people leaving for opportunities elsewhere. Without economic growth, they argued, Narsak would slowly empty out anyway. Mining offered a chance, perhaps the only realistic chance, for a different future. But many others strongly opposed it. As information about the project became more widely available, opposition organized. A grassroots movement formed, calling itself Uran? Namik? Uranium? No, in Greenlandic. The founders were local people, primarily from Narsak and surrounding settlements, sheep farmers, fishermen, hunting guides, teachers, shop owners. They organized protests at the proposed mine site. Photos from these demonstrations show people standing on tundra, holding signs, their faces serious with determination. Behind them, the landscape stretches empty and beautiful, mountains, fjords, the kind of pristine Arctic scenery that drew tourists and that locals valued deeply. One of the leading activists was Marianne Paviasen, a woman from Narsak who had grown up in the area, knew its rhythms and its people, understood what was at stake. She spoke at community meetings, gave interviews, organized resistance. Her arguments combined practical concerns, water quality, health risks, with deeper values about environmental protection, cultural preservation, and the right of local communities to determine their own futures. We fought hard to make this mine an issue for all Greenlanders, one resident later recalled. This wasn't just about Narsak. It was about what kind of Greenland we want. The movement grew beyond Narsak. People across Greenland paid attention. The debate intensified. The uranium question became central to Greenlandic politics in a way no one had anticipated. And in 2021, an election approached, one that would be remembered as the mining election. The people of Narsak, having raised their voices, waited to see if anyone was listening. Chapter 12. The Mining Election, April 6, 2021, Election Day in Greenland. In communities scattered across the island, Nuuk, Ilulissat, Sisimiut, Qaqortoq, and tiny settlements accessible only by boat or helicopter, people went to polling stations. The population eligible to vote was small by global standards, just under 40,000, but the stakes felt enormous. This election had become known simply as the mining election. One issue dominated all others. Would Greenland pursue large-scale resource extraction, particularly uranium mining, or would it prioritize environmental protection, even at the cost of economic opportunity? The incumbent coalition government, led by the Siumut Party, had supported mining development. They had worked with Greenland Minerals on the Kvanefjeld project for years, guiding it through feasibility studies and environmental impact assessments. In 2020, they had confirmed that the company had satisfied conditions to be entitled to an exploitation license. Final approval seemed imminent. The government argued that mining revenue could help Greenland reduce dependence on Danish subsidies, funding independence aspirations. But opposition had crystallized around the Inuit Ataqatigiit Party, IA for short. Their platform was explicit: ban uranium mining completely, stop the Kvanefjeld project, prioritize environmental protection, fishing, and tourism over extractive industries. Their campaign resonated with people like those in Narsak who had organized against the mine. Marianne Paviasen, the activist who had helped found Uranium, decided to run for parliament herself. She joined the Inuit Ataqatigiit Party, campaigning on the promise that local voices mattered, that communities near mining sites should have meaningful say in whether development proceeded. The campaign was hard-fought. Pro-mining advocates emphasized economic arguments. Greenland had a population of 57,000 and an economy dependent on fishing and approximately $500 million in annual subsidies from Denmark, roughly 20% of GDP. Mining could diversify that economy, create jobs, generate tax revenue. The Kvanefjeld project alone promised an estimated $22.8 billion in tax revenue over 37 years of operation. With that kind of money, Greenland could invest in infrastructure, education, healthcare, eventually achieving full independence from Denmark. Anti-mining advocates countered with environmental and cultural arguments. The fishing industry, Greenland's economic foundation, depended on clean water and healthy marine ecosystems. Tourism, a growing sector, depended on pristine landscapes and Greenland's image as unspoiled wilderness. Radioactive contamination from uranium mining could devastate both industries. And beyond economics, there was the question of values. What kind of society did Greenlanders want? One that extracted resources at any cost, or one that protected its environment for future generations? The debate sometimes turned bitter. Just before the election, Denmark's largest television station, TV2, published allegations of incompetence and corruption against Muta Burup Egede, leader of Inuit Ataqatigiit. The story was widely quoted across Danish and Greenlandic media. Only after the election did it emerge that the allegations were false, based on an anonymous memo that couldn't be verified. TV2 retracted the story, but the damage had been done, or attempted at least. On election day, voters made their choice. Inuit Ataqatigiit won. Not a landslide, but decisively. They would form a new coalition government. Muta Burup Egede became premier. Marianne Paviasen won her seat in parliament, bringing the voice of Narsak directly into the legislative chamber. The message was clear. Greenlanders, given the choice between economic development through uranium mining and environmental protection, chose protection. The new government moved quickly. By November 2021, Parliament debated legislation to ban uranium mining. The bill was specific in its language. No prospecting, exploration, or exploitation of any mineral resource would be allowed if the average uranium content exceeded 100 parts per million. This threshold was deliberately low, considered very low grade by international standards. The Kvanefjeld deposit averaged 266 parts per million across the total resource, rising to 362 ppm in the ore reserve sections. On November 10, 2021, Parliament passed Act No. 20, banning uranium mining. The vote wasn't unanimous, reflecting that Greenlandic society remained divided on the issue, but the majority supported the ban. The legislation also included provisions allowing prohibition of other radioactive minerals, such as thorium. The law was comprehensive, designed to prevent any loopholes that might allow uranium extraction under different legal frameworks. For the people of Narsak, there was relief. They had fought, their voices had been heard, and their government had acted. The mine would not be built 8 kilometers from their town. The waters of their fjord would not face contamination risks. Their children would grow up in the same environment they had known. For Greenland Minerals and its shareholders, there was shock. 15 years of work, hundreds of millions of dollars invested, approvals seemingly within reach, all blocked by legislation that effectively expropriated their project. The rare earths at Kvanefjeld, third largest deposit in the world, would remain in the ground. But this wasn't the end of the story. It was in many ways just the beginning of a new chapter. Chapter 13, The $11 Billion Question, July 19, 2023. Copenhagen. In a wood-paneled hearing room, an arbitral tribunal convened to consider one of the largest legal claims in Greenland's history. The claimant, Energy Transition Minerals Ltd., formerly known as Greenland Minerals and Energy, the Australian company that had spent 15 years developing the Kvanefjeld rare earth project. The respondents, the government of Greenland and the government of the Kingdom of Denmark, named as co-respondents in the proceedings. The claim, $11.5 billion in damages and interest. To put that figure in perspective, Greenland's entire GDP in 2023 was approximately $3 billion. The claim amounted to nearly 4 times the island's annual economic output, or roughly 10 times its annual government budget. For a territory of 57,000 people, the financial implications were staggering. The company's statement of claim ran to 517 pages, supported by independent expert reports, witness statements, and approximately 1,300 pieces of evidence. The document presented a detailed narrative of the company's activities in Greenland from 2007 onward, the exploration licenses obtained, the drilling programs completed, the feasibility studies finalized, the environmental assessments prepared, the community consultations conducted, the approvals received. Energy Transition Minerals argued that they had followed every regulation, completed every requirement, satisfied every condition. In April 2020, the Greenland government had written to them confirming they had satisfied the conditions under the Minerals Resources Act to be entitled to an exploitation license. The letter had outlined the remaining steps: approval of environmental and social impact assessments, completion of community consultation, but confirmed the company's fundamental right to a license once those steps were completed. Then came the 2021 election, the new government, and Act No. 20 banning uranium mining. The legislation didn't just deny the company's license application, it made the application impossible to approve under any circumstances. The rare earths at Kvanefjeld couldn't be extracted without bringing uranium to the surface. The company argued this constituted expropriation, the taking of property rights through legislative action rather than direct seizure, but expropriation nonetheless. An independent valuation firm, Secretariat Advisors of Canada, had been retained to quantify the damages. They valued the Kvanefjeld project at $7.5 billion or $7.2 billion, excluding uranium revenues. Adding interest calculated from the date of expropriation brought the total provisional claim to $11.5 billion. The company's legal team emphasized that the main objective wasn't actually money, it was reinstatement of the right to an exploitation license. The financial claim was presented as an alternative. If Greenland wouldn't allow the mine to proceed, it should compensate the company for the value of what was being taken. The case was being financed by Burford Capital, one of the world's largest litigation funding firms. Burford's business model involved investing in lawsuits in exchange for a portion of any eventual settlement or award. They had calculated that Energy Transition Minerals had a viable claim and were willing to put substantial capital behind it. If the company won, Burford would take a significant cut, typically 30 to 50% of the award. If the company lost, Burford would absorb the costs. This financing arrangement concerned many observers. It meant that even if Greenland's government wanted to settle, they would have to satisfy not just the company, but also Burford's profit expectations. The litigation funder had transformed a dispute between a mining company and a government into an investment vehicle. Similar cases had proliferated in recent years. Coal companies had sued governments over phase-out policies. Oil and gas firms had challenged drilling restrictions. The pattern was becoming familiar. Governments would implement environmental protections or climate policies, and companies would respond with massive damage claims under investment protection treaties. Some called it regulatory chill. The deterrent effect that billion-dollar lawsuits had on governments considering environmental regulations. Greenland's legal defense, conducted by the Danish government's Kammeradvokaten on behalf of both governments, rejected the claim as without merit. Their position was firm. Greenland had sovereign authority to regulate mining within its territory. Act No. 20 was a legitimate exercise of that authority, passed democratically by an elected parliament in response to public concerns about environmental and health risks. The defense argued that exploration licenses in Greenland, the type energy transition minerals had held, never guaranteed an exploitation license. The company had permission to explore, to study, to assess. But moving to actual mining required additional approvals that could be denied for various reasons, including new legislation. The 2011 amendment to their license had explicitly included a clause allowing rejection of exploitation requests for political reasons. Moreover, Greenland had reinstated a ban that had existed previously. Uranium mining had been prohibited from the 1950s until 2013, when it was briefly lifted. The 2021 law essentially restored the earlier policy. This wasn't arbitrary expropriation. It was democratic decision-making about acceptable risks. The government's legal advisor went further in documents obtained by environmental NGOs under public access laws. He stated that the arbitration case appeared to have no other purpose than to try to put undue pressure on the Greenlandic government in order to grant ETM an exploitation permit for the Kvanefjeld project, which the company has no legal claim to under Greenlandic law. The advisor expressed confidence that the arbitration tribunal would reject the claim. His bigger concern was whether energy transition minerals, structured as a complex corporate entity, would be able to pay Greenland's legal costs if the tribunal ruled against them. The company's financial structure suggested that recovering full costs might be difficult, even if Greenland prevailed. The case generated intense interest far beyond Greenland and Denmark. Mining industry representatives watched nervously. If Greenland could ban uranium mining and successfully defend against damage claims, would other governments feel emboldened to implement similar restrictions? Environmental groups watched hopefully. Might this case establish precedent for governments' rights to prioritize environmental protection over mining investments? The arbitration proceedings continued through 2023 and into 2024 with no quick resolution in sight. Legal experts suggested the case could take years to resolve fully, with potential appeals extending it even longer. Meanwhile, the political risk perception around Greenland had fundamentally changed. Today, the political risk in Greenland is considered to be higher than in many African countries, noted one mining consultant familiar with the territory. The $11 billion lawsuit hung over every discussion of mineral development, a warning to future investors that licenses and approvals might not provide the security they seem to promise. The rare earths at Kvanefjeld remained untouched, but now they were entangled not just in geological complexity and economic challenges, but in international law, corporate finance, and geopolitical tension. The question wasn't just whether the minerals could be extracted, but whether they should be, and who had the authority to make that decision. Chapter 14. The One That Might Succeed. While Kvanefjeld remained frozen in litigation, another project in the same fjord network quietly moved forward. Tanbreez. The name comes from the Greenlandic tasek, meaning lake, combined with breeze from breccia, the geological term for fractured rock cemented together. The deposit sits near the southern tip of Greenland, in the same Gardar province that had made Gvanefjeld famous, but with one crucial difference: significantly lower uranium content. The Tanbreez deposit is massive. Resource estimates suggest it contains approximately 45 million tons of rare earth elements, making it potentially the largest such deposit in the world by some measures. More importantly, the ore contains a high proportion of heavy, rare earth elements. Approximately 27% of the total rare earth content consists of the more valuable heavy elements like dysprosium, terbium, and yttrium. Heavy rare earths matter more than the numbers suggest. While light rare earths like lanthanum and cerium have uses, the heavy elements are what drive modern technology. Dysprosium makes permanent magnets work at high temperatures, essential for electric vehicle motors. Terbium enables the green phosphors in displays. Yttrium is critical for LED lighting and laser technologies. These elements are scarcer, harder to source, and command premium prices. Tanbreez also contains valuable quantities of gallium, a critical element for semiconductors, fiber optics, and solar cells. China currently controls approximately 98% of global gallium supply. Any Western source would be strategically significant. The deposit occurs in eudialyte ore, the same complex mineral that challenged processing at Kvanefjeld. No one had yet proven that eudialyte could be processed economically at commercial scale. Various pilot programs had tested different approaches: acid leaching, alkaline processing, hybrid methods, but uncertainties remained. This technical risk applied equally to Kvanefjeld and Tanbreez. But Tanbreez had the uranium advantage. While some uranium existed in the deposit, concentrations were well below the 100 parts per million threshold that Act No. 20 had established. The deposit could be mined without violating Greenland's uranium ban. This single factor made all the difference. The project moved through development more slowly than Kvanefjeld had. Different companies held the license at different times. Technical studies progressed incrementally. Financing remained challenging. Arctic mining projects with unproven processing technology didn't attract easy capital, even without uranium complications. Then in 2024, the project was sold to Critical Metals Corp., a New York-based company. The sale itself was notable for what didn't happen. Chinese companies had reportedly made offers for the project, potentially offering more than Critical Metals paid. But U.S. officials had lobbied heavily against Chinese acquisition. The message was diplomatic but clear: allowing China to control one of the world's largest rare earth deposits outside Chinese territory would undermine Western efforts to diversify supply chains. Critical Metals Corp. prevailed. The company emphasized its U.S. backing, its commitment to Western supply chains, its alignment with European and North American security interests. The sale represented a geopolitical choice as much as an economic transaction. In October 2024, the Greenland government granted Critical Metals an extension on the exploitation license for Tanbreez. The extension came with specific requirements and deadlines. Mining and closure plans must be submitted by the end of 2025. Financial guarantees must be provided by June 2026. Mining operations must commence by the end of 2028. These weren't suggestions or aspirations. They were legal obligations. If Critical Metals failed to meet any deadline, the license could be revoked. The government had learned from the Kvanefjeld controversy. No more indefinite licenses. No more companies holding rights for years without progressing toward actual operation. either develop the mine or lose the right to do so. Critical Metals announced plans for a modular approach, starting with smaller-scale production to prove the processing technology and economics, then scaling up over time. This strategy acknowledged the technical risks while creating a pathway forward. If the initial modules worked, expansion would follow. If not, the losses would be contained. The company emphasized environmental management. Modern monitoring systems would track water quality continuously. Waste handling would follow best international practices. The operation would seek to avoid the mistakes of legacy mines from earlier eras. Whether these promises would translate to reality remained to be seen, but at least the conversation acknowledged environmental concerns prominently. Community engagement was also emphasized, partly because the Kvanefjeld controversy had demonstrated the cost of failing to secure local support. Critical Metals held consultations in nearby settlements. They promised jobs for Greenlanders, training programs, local procurement where possible. The approach was careful, deliberate, recognizing that social license to operate was as important as government permits. Of the 147 active mineral licenses in Greenland, only 2 had progressed to exploitation licenses: Tanbreeze and a small gold mine called Nalunak. This statistic revealed how difficult the transition from exploration to production remained, even for promising deposits. Environmental approval processes were lengthy. Community consultation took time. Technical challenges had to be solved. Financing had to be secured. Each step filtered out most projects. Tanbreeze had survived all these filters. It had the geology, massive reserves of valuable heavy rare earths. It had the political viability, no uranium ban blocking development. It had Western backing, U.S. companies and government interests aligned in supporting it. It had a development plan, modular approach reducing risk, and it had deadlines, forcing actual progress rather than indefinite planning. Whether Tanbreeze would actually succeed remained uncertain. The 2028 deadline for commencing operations was approaching. The processing technology was still unproven at scale. The Arctic logistics remained brutally expensive. The market for rare earths could shift. Prices might drop. Demand might change. Competing sources might emerge. But Tanbreeze represented hope. It showed that Greenland's rare earth deposits could potentially be developed, that the environmental and political challenges could be navigated, that alternatives to Chinese rare earth dominance might be possible. In the same southern fjords where Kvanefjeld lay dormant and disputed, Tanbreeze moved slowly but steadily toward becoming Greenland's first rare earth mine. The sleeping giant was, perhaps, finally beginning to wake. Chapter 15. The Infrastructure Puzzle. Even if Tanbreeze solved the technical and political challenges, one fundamental problem remained. How do you build a mine where nothing exists? The phrase greenfield development takes on literal meaning in Greenland. There is no field, green or otherwise. No roads lead to remote mineral deposits. No power lines extend beyond the small coastal towns. No ports exist capable of handling bulk mineral exports. No workforce housing stands ready. Every single element of infrastructure must be created from nothing, in conditions that resist construction at every turn. Consider the basic challenge of moving equipment to a mine site. In most mining regions, you would hire heavy trucks to transport machinery along existing highways. In Greenland, those highways don't exist. Equipment arrives by ship at the nearest coastal point, perhaps dozens of kilometers from the actual deposit. From there, it must be moved by helicopter, by barge if water routes allow, or by constructing temporary roads across tundra and permafrost. Building roads in Arctic conditions presents unique engineering challenges. conventional asphalt, and concrete crack under freeze-thaw cycles. The active layer, the surface soil that thaws each summer and refreezes each winter, shifts and deforms, destroying road foundations. Permafrost beneath the active layer seems solid, but changes as climate warms. Engineering studies predict the active layer thickness could increase by 1 to 3 meters by 2050, fundamentally altering ground conditions. Solutions exist, but increase costs dramatically. Roads can be built on gravel pads thick enough to insulate the permafrost beneath. Thermosiphons, passive heat exchange devices, can be installed to keep ground frozen. Elevated structures allow cold air circulation underneath. But each solution adds expense. Industry analyses suggest that transportation infrastructure in Arctic mining projects costs 30 to 50% more than temperate equivalents. Port facilities present similar challenges. Existing Greenlandic ports were designed for fishing vessels and small cargo ships. A commercial rare earth mine might produce hundreds of thousands of tons of concentrate annually. Loading that volume requires deep water berths, bulk handling equipment, storage facilities, and access during ice-free months. Nuuk's Port, Greenland's largest, handled 2 million tons of total cargo in 2021. A single large mine could exceed that entire capacity. Building a new port in Arctic waters means accounting for sea ice scour on pilings, storm waves amplified by ice breakup, and extremely limited construction seasons. Everything must be engineered to withstand forces that structures in temperate zones never experience. Energy infrastructure compounds the problem. Mining and processing operations consume enormous amounts of electricity, crushing ore, running separation chemistry, pumping water, heating facilities. In most mining regions, operations connect to electrical grids supplied by centralized power stations. In remote Greenland, no grid exists to connect to. The default solution is diesel generation. Ship in fuel oil, burn it in generators, produce electricity on site. This works, but dramatically increases operating costs and carbon emissions. Rare earth processing is energy intensive. Running it on diesel power makes Greenland projects less competitive against operations with access to cheap hydroelectric or grid power. Hydroelectric alternatives exist in theory. Greenland has abundant water from glacial melt. Some mine proposals include building small hydroelectric facilities. But constructing dams and power stations in Arctic conditions adds years to development timelines and billions to capital costs. The infrastructure must be built before the mine operates, creating a financing challenge. How do you pay for power infrastructure before revenue flows? Worker accommodation becomes another major infrastructure component. Mining in remote Greenland means most workers will be temporary, rotating in for weeks or months, then rotating out. This requires not just dormitories, but entire self-contained communities, kitchens, dining halls, recreation facilities, medical clinics, communication systems, water treatment, sewage handling, fuel storage, equipment maintenance shops. These instant towns must function in extreme cold during months of darkness, through storms that would shut down operations in less harsh environments. Everything must be shipped in, not just the structures, but the fuel to heat them, the food to stock them, the medical supplies to equip them, the spare parts to maintain them. Recognizing these challenges, some policy experts have proposed a different approach: mining corridors. Rather than having each project build isolated infrastructure, the government could designate priority corridors and develop shared infrastructure, ports, power generation, road networks that multiple projects could use. The U.S. International Development Finance Corporation and Export-Import Bank have discussed investing in Greenlandic infrastructure corridors to increase project viability. The concept would work like infrastructure concessions elsewhere. Government leads planning and permitting, establishes access rules and regulations, while private operators finance, build, and operate the facilities with regulated third-party access. This approach could reduce individual project costs and timelines. If 3 mining projects can share a port, instead of each building their own, the economics improve dramatically. If power infrastructure serves multiple customers, financing becomes more feasible. But infrastructure corridors require coordination, long-term planning, substantial upfront investment, and political will to designate priority areas. Greenland's government, with limited administrative capacity and competing demands, would need significant international support to implement such ambitious programs. For now, each mining project must essentially solve the infrastructure puzzle independently, driving costs to levels that make even valuable deposits economically marginal. The minerals are worth billions. The infrastructure to reach them might cost billions as well. Chapter 16. The European Partnership. In 2023, geologists completed a comprehensive survey of Greenland's mineral potential. The results, published in collaboration with the European Commission, revealed something remarkable. 25 of the 34 minerals deemed critical raw materials by the European Union existed in Greenland in significant quantities. The list read like a periodic table of modern technology. Rare earth elements, lithium, graphite, niobium, hafnium, zirconium, tungsten, gallium, platinum group metals. These weren't just valuable commodities, they were essential inputs for the energy transition that Europe had committed to pursuing. Electric vehicles, wind turbines, solar panels, battery storage, hydrogen electrolyzers, all depended on minerals that Europe largely imported, primarily from China. The geopolitical implications were stark. Europe had set ambitious targets for reducing carbon emissions. Meeting those targets required massive deployment of clean energy technologies. But those technologies required minerals that Europe didn't control. Supply disruptions could derail the entire transition. Alternative sources were desperately needed. Greenland, sitting between Europe and North America, aligned with Western institutions, possessing enormous mineral wealth, represented exactly what Europe needed. But how to develop it? In late 2024, the European Union and Greenland signed strategic partnership agreements focused on sustainable development of critical mineral value chains. The agreements differed significantly from traditional mining arrangements. Rather than simple extraction contracts, they emphasized long-term collaboration, technology transfer, environmental protection, and respect for Greenlandic sovereignty. The EU committed to providing patient capital, long-term financing at favorable rates, recognizing that Arctic projects require extended development timelines that pure commercial investors might not accept. Technical support would flow from European geological surveys, mining institutes, and research centers. Training programs would help build Greenlandic capacity in mining engineering, environmental management, and regulatory oversight. Crucially, the agreements emphasized sustainability. Projects would need to meet stringent environmental standards, conduct thorough impact assessments, and secure genuine community support before proceeding. The Kvanefjeld controversy had taught everyone that imposed development without local consent would fail, no matter how attractive the economics appeared on paper. A similar partnership agreement followed with the United States. American strategic interests in Arctic security and rare earth supply aligned with support for Greenlandic mineral development. The approach mirrored the European model. Collaboration rather than exploitation, long-term thinking rather than quick extraction, respect for environmental and social concerns. These partnerships represented a different model than Chinese investments that had been proposed and rejected in previous years. China had offered to finance airports, buy mining projects, build infrastructure, but always with terms that raised sovereignty concerns. The Western partnerships, whatever their other limitations, at least acknowledged Greenland's autonomy and right to set conditions. The agreements didn't guarantee success. They didn't magically solve the infrastructure challenges, the processing technology uncertainties, or the brutal Arctic economics, but they created frameworks for addressing these challenges collaboratively. European and American institutions could provide resources and expertise that Greenland lacked. Greenland could provide access to minerals that Europe and America desperately needed. If managed carefully, the arrangement might work for both sides. Greenland's government approached these partnerships cautiously, aware of the island's colonial history under Danish rule. The Minister of Business and Mineral Resources stated the position clearly. Western partnerships were strongly preferred, but if sufficient investment and support didn't materialize, Greenland would have to consider all options. The implicit warning was unmistakable. Neglect from Western partners might force Greenland toward Chinese engagement, despite the complications. The partnerships acknowledged a fundamental reality. Developing Greenland's minerals would take decades, not years. Exploration required time. Feasibility studies required time. Environmental assessments required time. Infrastructure construction required time. Community engagement required time. Rushing any step risked failure. The sleeping giants were waking slowly, deliberately, with uncertain outcomes. But at least frameworks now existed for attempting their development in ways that might respect both economic needs and environmental limits. Whether these frameworks would prove sufficient remained to be seen. Chapter 17. Climate's Irony. The ice that had hidden Greenland's minerals for 3 million years was melting. Since 1995, an area the size of Albania had disappeared from the ice sheet. Approximately 28,000 square kilometers of ice transformed to water, flowing into the ocean, contributing to global sea level rise. The pace was accelerating. Mass loss from the Greenland ice sheet had increased more than sixfold, from 34 billion tons per year in the 1990s to 215 billion tons per year in the 2010s, with no sign of slowing. The irony was almost too perfect to bear. The minerals buried beneath that ice, particularly the rare earth elements, were essential for the technologies needed to combat climate change. Wind turbines required neodymium and dysprosium for their powerful permanent magnets. Electric vehicles needed the same elements in their motors. Solar panel manufacturing used various rare earth compounds. Battery storage systems required lithium, graphite, and other minerals Greenland possessed. To stop burning fossil fuels, the world needed these minerals. To get these minerals from Greenland, the ice had to retreat. But the ice was retreating because of fossil fuel emissions. The circularity was dizzying. Climate change was making some Greenlandic resources more accessible. Reduced sea ice extended operational seasons. Ships could reach coastal areas for longer periods each year. Some deposits previously buried under glacial ice were becoming exposed. Areas that had been solid ice were now revealing bedrock and mineralization. But the same changes created new complications. Permafrost degradation, the thawing of permanently frozen ground, undermined foundation stability for mining infrastructure. Specialized construction techniques that had been developed for stable permafrost conditions now had to account for ground that was becoming unpredictable. The active layer thickening meant foundations designed for one set of conditions would face different conditions within years. Weather patterns became less predictable. Mining operations need predictability, knowing when ships can arrive, when construction seasons begin and end, when storms are likely. Climate change was making Greenland's weather more variable and extreme. Planning became harder. Risk increased. Insurance costs rose. For traditional Greenlandic livelihoods, the changes were even more profound. Fishing patterns shifted as water temperatures changed and species moved to different areas. Hunting became more difficult and dangerous as ice conditions grew unreliable. Traditional knowledge, accumulated over generations about ice thickness, weather signs, animal movements, was becoming less reliable as the climate departed from historical patterns. These disruptions created economic pressures that influenced attitudes toward mining. When fishing becomes less predictable and hunting more dangerous, alternative employment becomes more attractive. Some Greenlanders, who might have opposed mining development in more stable times, now reconsidered, seeing it as necessary economic adaptation to changing conditions. The ice sheet's retreat also revealed something scientists hadn't expected. Ice cores drilled at Camp Century in northwestern Greenland showed that beneath nearly 1.4 kilometers of ice lay soil that was 2.7 million years old, complete with preserved plant material. The ice sheet had melted completely at least once in the past million years, probably during a warm interglacial period when temperatures were only slightly higher than present. This discovery had implications beyond scientific curiosity. It meant the ice sheet was more vulnerable to warming than many models had predicted. It meant complete loss of the ice, and the 7 meters of sea level rise that would accompany it was not an impossibility if warming continued. And it meant that minerals currently under ice might become accessible faster than anyone had planned for. The geology beneath the ice sheet remained largely unknown, surveyed only through radar and other remote sensing. As ice retreated, new deposits might be revealed, changing calculations about Greenland's mineral wealth. The climate was unlocking the minerals needed to address the climate. The problem was creating access to its own solution at potentially catastrophic cost. The ice continued melting. The minerals waited beneath it, and the terrible irony persisted, unresolved. Chapter 18. The Question of Sovereignty, December 2024. President Donald Trump, preparing for his second term in office, renewed his interest in acquiring Greenland. It wasn't the first time. During his first presidency in 2019, Trump had floated the idea of purchasing the island from Denmark. Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen had called the suggestion absurd, prompting Trump to cancel a planned state visit to Denmark. The episode had seemed like a bizarre diplomatic footnote, quickly forgotten. But now, returning to the White House, Trump brought the idea back. In public statements, he oscillated between emphasizing national security and downplaying mineral interests. "We need Greenland for national security purposes," he declared in one interview, adding, "not for minerals." In another context, he emphasized critical minerals and the need to counter Chinese dominance. The messaging was inconsistent, but the interest was persistent. House Speaker Mike Johnson told reporters that America's pursuit of Greenland has to do with national security and critical minerals and many other reasons. The mixed messaging revealed genuine ambiguity about motivations. Was Greenland wanted for its strategic Arctic location, its rare earth deposits, or both? Greenland's response was unambiguous. Greenland is not for sale, stated Premier Muteburup Egede. The territory's government reaffirmed its commitment to greater independence from Denmark, but independence on Greenlandic terms, not absorption into another nation. "We want to be masters of our own future," became the consistent message. Denmark backed Greenland firmly. European allies expressed alarm at American rhetoric, suggesting potential acquisition, forcible or otherwise, of territory belonging to a NATO member state. The diplomatic friction was real and growing. In the U.S. Senate, Democratic Senator Ruben Gallego of Arizona introduced legislation to restrict potential military action regarding Greenland. The bill reflected concerns that Trump's interest might extend beyond diplomatic persuasion. The very fact that such legislation was considered necessary revealed how seriously some officials took the situation. Behind the rhetorical flourishes lay genuine strategic considerations. Greenland hosts Pituffik Space Base, formerly Thule Air Base, a critical installation for ballistic missile early warning systems and space surveillance. Its location provides unique coverage of Arctic airspace and potential missile trajectories from Russia. As Arctic sea ice retreats, new shipping routes are opening. The Northwest Passage through Canadian Arctic waters and the Northern Sea Route along Russia's coast. Greenland sits at the junction of these routes. Russia has been rebuilding Soviet-era Arctic military bases, expanding its northern fleet, conducting exercises. China, declaring itself a near-Arctic state, despite being 1,400 kilometers from the Arctic Circle, has been pursuing scientific research stations, shipping route development, and resource investments across the Arctic region. From a U.S. strategic perspective, Greenland matters enormously, regardless of minerals. But minerals do matter. Greenland possesses an estimated 1.5 million metric tons of proven rare earth reserves, roughly comparable to U.S. reserves, and substantially more than Canada's 830,000 metric tons. If less certain estimates of 36 million metric tons prove accurate, Greenland could rival China's reserves. For a United States trying to reduce dependence on Chinese rare earth processing, Greenland represents one of the few realistic alternative sources. Yet the fixation on acquisition struck many experts as misguided. The hype far outstrips the hard science and economics behind these critical minerals, noted Tracy Hughes, executive director of the Critical Minerals Institute. Even if the U.S. somehow acquired Greenland, the infrastructure challenges, processing technology gaps, and Arctic logistics wouldn't disappear. Ownership wouldn't magically make the minerals economically viable to extract. Moreover, the aggressive rhetoric complicated the very partnerships that might actually advance U.S. interests. Greenland was already working with American companies, accepting U.S. financing for infrastructure, entering strategic agreements aligned with Western supply chains. Heavy-handed pressure risked undermining these relationships, potentially pushing Greenland toward the Chinese partnerships that U.S. policy sought to prevent. For Greenlanders, the situation revived uncomfortable historical memories. Greenland had been a Danish colony for centuries, only achieving home rule in 1979 and self-government in 2009. The island still received substantial subsidies from Denmark, approximately $500 million annually, roughly 20% of GDP. Full independence remained aspirational, constrained by economic realities. Mineral development represented one potential path to economic self-sufficiency. If mining could generate substantial revenues, Greenland might reduce dependence on Danish subsidies, eventually achieving full sovereignty. But achieving that goal required careful navigation. attracting investment and expertise while maintaining control over terms and conditions, balancing economic development against environmental protection, ensuring that resource extraction didn't recreate colonial patterns of wealth extraction. Trump's acquisition rhetoric threatened to derail this careful balancing act. If every discussion about mineral development became entangled with sovereignty questions and American territorial ambitions, community support would evaporate. Greenlanders had already demonstrated, through the mining election and uranium ban, that they would reject development imposed from outside, regardless of economic arguments. The sovereignty question hung over every aspect of Greenland's mineral future. Could a territory of 57,000 people maintain autonomy while foreign companies invested billions in infrastructure? Could genuine partnerships exist between such asymmetric parties? Could Greenland leverage its mineral wealth to achieve independence, or would that wealth make independence impossible by creating dependencies on foreign capital, expertise, and markets? The minerals remained in the ground, increasingly valuable, increasingly contested. But the contest was no longer just about geology, economics, or technology. It had become fundamentally political, about who controls resources, who benefits from their extraction, and whether small nations can maintain sovereignty over valuable assets that larger powers covet. The rocks held rare earth elements, uranium, and gold. But the real treasure being fought over was self-determination itself. Chapter 19. The Legacy Mines Speak. Before looking forward, it's worth looking back at what actually happened when mines operated in Greenland without adequate environmental oversight. In 2022, researchers published a comprehensive study examining 3 legacy mines from the pre-1970s era, when environmental regulations barely existed and monitoring was minimal. The sites they examined had been abandoned for decades, rusted equipment scattered across tundra, collapsed buildings slowly being reclaimed by moss and lichen, tailings ponds left open to weather and wildlife. The findings were sobering. Heavy metal contamination persisted at all 3 sites. Lead concentrations in soil exceeded safe levels by orders of magnitude. Zinc had leached into groundwater and surface streams. Other metals, cadmium, copper, arsenic, showed up in sediment samples far downstream from the mine sites. Decades after operations ceased, the pollution remained, moving slowly through the ecosystem. Fish in affected streams showed elevated metal concentrations in their tissues. Plants growing in contaminated soil accumulated toxins. The food chain carried pollution upward, small organisms to larger ones, eventually reaching the seals, birds, and caribou that people still hunted. But the same study included an important counterpoint. Researchers also examined mines established in the last 20 years, operated under modern environmental regulations with monitoring requirements and closure plans. At these newer sites, they found no significant pollution. Water quality remained within acceptable parameters. Soil samples showed no elevated metal concentrations. Wildlife populations appeared unaffected. The contrast was instructive. Mining could be done more cleanly now than in the past. Environmental standards, properly enforced, could prevent the worst contamination. Technology had improved. Better waste containment, more efficient processing that left fewer toxins in tailings, continuous monitoring systems that detected problems before they became catastrophic. Yet the legacy mines provided a cautionary reminder. Even with best intentions and modern technology, things could go wrong. Equipment failed. Human error occurred. Companies went bankrupt, leaving cleanup unfunded. Monitoring lapsed. What seemed securely contained in one decade might leak in the next, and Arctic environments recovered slowly from damage. In temperate zones, vegetation regrows quickly, soil microorganisms break down pollutants, rainfall dilutes contamination. In the Arctic, where temperatures stay below freezing most of the year and biological processes operate slowly, pollution persists. Toxins remain bioavailable longer. Ecosystems take decades or centuries to recover rather than years. The study's implications went beyond scientific findings. For communities like Narsak, the legacy mines demonstrated that promises about environmental protection had to be backed by enforceable regulations, adequate monitoring, and guaranteed funding for closure and remediation. Corporate assurances weren't sufficient. International environmental standards weren't sufficient. Even government oversight wasn't sufficient if that oversight lacked resources or authority. What would happen if a rare earth mine operated for 30 years? Then the parent company restructured, moving assets to subsidiaries that later declared bankruptcy. Who would fund the cleanup? Denmark? The European Union? Would international arbitration tribunals force Greenland to bear costs, claiming that regulations had driven companies away? These weren't hypothetical concerns. The mining industry worldwide was full of examples of abandoned sites, unfunded liabilities, contamination left for governments and communities to address. The Kvanefjeld arbitration case itself demonstrated how international investment protections could constrain government authority to regulate and enforce environmental standards. Greenlanders also remembered Ivitut in this context. The cryolite mine had operated for 133 years, generating substantial wealth, though exactly how much remained disputed, and how much stayed in Greenland versus flowing to Denmark was even more contentious. Then it closed, and within years the town emptied. The buildings stood abandoned. No economic transition plan existed. People who had built lives around the mine found themselves with skills that were no longer needed in a place with no alternative employment. Would rare earth mining follow the same pattern? 30 or 40 years of operation, revenues flowing primarily to foreign companies and distant governments, local communities experiencing disruption and environmental risk, then sudden closure when deposits exhausted or prices dropped, leaving abandoned infrastructure and contaminated sites? Or could it be different this time? Could revenues be structured to build lasting economic capacity rather than dependence? Could closure plans be funded up front through bonds or escrow accounts? Could monitoring continue after operations ceased? Could local employment and training create skills transferable to other sectors? The legacy mines spoke, but their message was ambiguous. They showed both that environmental damage from mining could persist for generations, and that modern practices could avoid such damage. They demonstrated both that promises could be broken and that proper oversight could enforce accountability. The lesson seemed to be mining in Greenland was possible, but only with extraordinary care, robust regulation, genuine community control, and long-term thinking that extended beyond quarterly profits or political election cycles. Whether such conditions could be met remained an open question. Epilogue. What remains beneath? Return now to where we began. Ivitut, the abandoned mining town on Greenland's southern coast. The buildings still stand, weathered by decades of Arctic storms. Paint peels from wooden walls. Windows stare empty at the gray waters of Arsuk Fjord. The massive pit where cryolite was extracted for 133 years has filled with water so clear it reflects the sky like a mirror. Around its edges, white fragments of cryolite still lie scattered. The ice stone that launched Greenland's first industrial operation, Now just mineral debris on rocky shores. Tourists occasionally arrive by ship, walking the silent streets, photographing the abandoned structures, standing at the edge of the water-filled pit. The cemetery on the hillside remains the most carefully maintained area, graves overlooking the fjord, where ships no longer come. This place represents Greenland's mineral story in miniature. Discovered, exploited, exhausted, abandoned. But the broader story is profoundly different. Greenland's main mineral wealth remains largely untouched, waiting in darkness and cold as it has for millions of years. The numbers are staggering. An estimated 1.5 million metric tons of rare earth elements in proven reserves, possibly 36 million tons total if less certain estimates prove accurate. Uranium deposits among the world's largest, 270,000 tons at Kvanefjeld alone. Diamonds in kimberlite pipes throughout the western regions. Gold scattered across multiple sites, graphite, copper, zinc, platinum, molybdenum, tantalum, niobium, tungsten, gallium. 25 of the 34 minerals deemed critical by the European Union. Estimated total value reaching into the trillions of dollars. Why has it remained buried? The answer is layered like the ancient geological formations themselves. Geography isolated the island, thousands of kilometers from major markets, surrounded by cold seas that freeze solid for months each year. Ice covered the deposits, hiding them from view, making exploration difficult and extraction nearly impossible in many areas. Climate made operations prohibitively expensive. Arctic conditions multiplying costs 3 to 5 times beyond temperate equivalents. Infrastructure never developed because demand never justified the enormous investment required. Processing technology, particularly for the unusual eudialyte ore that hosts Greenland's rare earths, remained unproven at commercial scale. Political will wavered between development and protection. The 2021 mining election demonstrated that Greenlanders, given the choice, would prioritize environmental safety over immediate economic gain. Communities valued clean water, traditional livelihoods, and cultural continuity more than distant promises of mining revenues. International dynamics complicated simple economics, geopolitical competition over Arctic resources, investment protection treaties, constraining regulatory authority, competing visions of sustainable development. Each reason alone might not have been sufficient to keep the minerals buried. Together, they formed barriers as effective as the ice itself. Is this a story of failure? Perhaps not. Perhaps it's a story of wisdom, a small population choosing carefully, weighing true costs, protecting what matters most. Perhaps it's a story of patience, waiting for technology to improve, for processing methods to mature, for partnerships to develop that genuinely respect sovereignty and environment. Or perhaps it's simply a story of timing. Minerals that weren't valuable enough to justify extraction yesterday might become essential tomorrow. As rare earth demand grows, as Chinese supply restrictions tighten, as climate technology deployment accelerates, the economics that make Greenland marginal today could shift dramatically. What seems impossibly expensive now might become unavoidable necessity within a decade. The question isn't whether Greenland's minerals have value. They demonstrably do. The question is whether that value exceeds the full costs, environmental risks, community disruption, sovereignty concerns, infrastructure requirements, and the opportunity costs of paths not taken. Greenland stands at a threshold. Behind lies a history of colonial exploitation and resource extraction that primarily benefited others. Ahead lie multiple possible futures: mineral wealth funding, genuine independence and prosperity, environmental catastrophe destroying traditional livelihoods, muddled compromise satisfying no one, or continued waiting while the minerals remain exactly where they are. The ice continues melting, 7 meters of sea level rise waiting in frozen form, gradually being released. The minerals wait beneath it and beside it, their existence certain, their future unknown. 3 million years they've been there. Perhaps they'll wait longer still. For now, Greenland's hidden wealth stays hidden, protected by ice and distance, by cost and controversy, by the careful deliberation of people who understand that some treasures carry prices beyond money, and that sometimes the wisest choice is to leave wealth where it lies, waiting for a future that might bring better answers than the present can provide. Hope we'll meet again soon for another story.